A king who could command thousands had forgotten how to enjoy a single meal. The words drifted through the halls of Blackthorn Palace like a rumor no one dared speak too loudly. Yet every servant knew they were true. For 3 long months, King Rowan Blackthorn had barely eaten. The palace physicians called it exhaustion. The royal advisors blamed stress. Traveling healers arrived from distant territories carrying rare herbs and ancient remedies. None of them helped. Every morning, silver trays loaded with carefully prepared breakfasts were carried into the king's private dining chamber. Every morning, those same trays returned almost untouched. The grand palace, sitting atop the northern cliffs, overlooked miles of forests and rivers, a kingdom blessed with abundance. Yet inside its stone walls, anxiety hung heavier than winter fog. A king who would not eat was a kingdom that could not rest. Servants whispered about it while polishing marble floors. Guards exchanged worried glances during their shifts. Even the cooks felt the pressure. Especially the cooks. Deep beneath the royal residence, the palace kitchens roared with heat and motion. Massive ovens glowed from before sunrise. Copper pots simmered. Fresh bread baked. The scent of roasted vegetables, herbs, and stock filled the air. Dozens of cooks moved between stations, each hoping their creation might be the one meal capable of reaching the king. Clara Whitmore kept her head down as she worked near the farthest preparation table. That was exactly where she preferred to be. Invisible. Forgotten. Safe. She crushed cinnamon sticks inside a stone mortar, her movements steady and practiced. Beside them sat cloves, star anise, nutmeg, and dried orange peel. Their fragrances blended together into something warm and comforting. Most people assumed Clara simply loved spices. No one questioned why she used them so often. No one knew the real reason. The scent of cinnamon clung to her apron. Cloves lingered in her dark blonde hair. Nutmeg dusted her fingertips. Every day she surrounded herself with spices powerful enough to bury something she never wanted anyone to notice. Her omega scent. Clara pressed the pestle harder against the mixture. The familiar aroma rose around her immediately. Safe. Hidden. Controlled. 3 years earlier, she had learned exactly what happened when people noticed an omega who didn't belong. She had no desire to relive that lesson. Whitmore. The sharp voice snapped her from her thoughts. She looked up. Head chef Bernard stood across the table, his heavy brows furrowed. Those vegetables won't chop themselves. Yes, chef. Clara quickly moved to the cutting board. Around her, the kitchen buzzed with tension. Another breakfast had been returned untouched. Another failure. The cooks were running out of ideas. The king rejected everything again, someone muttered. Even the maple-glazed pastries. Those cost half a day's wages to make. Doesn't matter. A woman sighed. Nothing matters anymore. Clara listened quietly while slicing carrots into perfect pieces. She understood disappointment. She understood loneliness. But she could not imagine living inside a palace where everyone watched her every move. Rowan Blackthorn ruled the largest territory in the north. Songs were written about his victories. Children played games pretending to be him. Yet somehow, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom sat alone at a table every morning, unable to enjoy a meal. The thought lingered longer than she expected. Strange. Clara shook it away and returned to work. Hours passed. Orders came and went. Pots simmered. Loaves cooled on racks. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the high kitchen windows. Then suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The kitchen doors burst open. A royal messenger hurried inside carrying a sealed document. Every conversation stopped. Every knife paused. The messenger approached head chef Bernard. Direct order from His Majesty. Silence swallowed the room. Bernard broke the seal and scanned the page. His face turned pale. Well? Someone asked nervously. The chef swallowed. The king requests a completely new dinner menu tonight. Groans spread through the kitchen. Again, we already changed everything last week. What does he want? Bernard stared at the parchment. Something simple. The cooks exchanged confused looks. Simple. One repeated. That's all it says. Bernard nodded slowly. Something simple. Something honest. The room fell silent once more. No one understood what that meant. No one except Clara. Her gaze drifted toward the basket of vegetables sitting beside her station. Fresh onions, celery, potatoes, carrots. Ingredients her mother once used to make soup during cold winters. Nothing expensive, nothing elaborate, just food made with care. For the first time all day, Clara felt a strange pull inside her chest. A quiet feeling she couldn't explain. Across the kingdom, thousands feared disappointing the Alpha King. Yet somehow, standing among the noise and heat of the kitchen, Clara found herself wondering something entirely different. Not why the king refused to eat, but what kind of loneliness could make a man forget the taste of comfort. That evening, rain tapped softly against the palace windows as the royal kitchens raced against the clock. Every station worked with nervous energy. Head chef Bernard barked orders from one end of the room to the other, while assistants hurried between ovens and preparation tables carrying trays, bowls, and baskets. Nobody wanted to be responsible for another meal the king would refuse. Clara stood quietly at her station peeling potatoes. The conversation from earlier still lingered in her mind. Something simple. Something honest. Those words felt different from the complicated requests that usually came from the palace. Most nobles demanded extravagance. They wanted towering desserts, imported spices, and dishes decorated like works of art. Yet the king had asked for simplicity. It felt strangely personal, as if he was searching for something he had lost. Clara glanced toward a large stockpot simmering nearby. Vegetables floated gently beneath the surface. The rich scent reminded her of childhood winters in a small cottage far from the capital. Snow against the windows. Her mother humming softly while stirring soup over a fire. Warm bread cooling on the table. For a moment, she could almost hear that voice again. Then reality returned with the sound of a tray crashing somewhere across the kitchen. Clara quickly focused on her work. An hour later, chaos erupted near the main preparation counter. One of the senior cooks accidentally ruined the evening soup after oversalting an entire batch. Frustration spread through the kitchen immediately. They did not have enough time to start over properly. Head chef Bernard rubbed both hands across his face. "We need another soup. Fast." Several cooks exchanged worried looks. Nobody volunteered. Bernard's gaze swept across the room before landing unexpectedly on Clara. "Whitmore." She froze. "Yes, chef. You worked in tavern kitchens before coming here." "Yes, chef. Can you make soup?" Clara blinked. Of all the questions she expected, that was not one of them. "I can." "Then make one." The chef pointed toward the stockpot. "Simple. Honest. We have less than an hour." Clara's heart stumbled. Around her, several cooks looked skeptical. Nobody expected much from the quiet woman who spent most of her days chopping vegetables and cleaning stations. But Bernard had already moved on to solve another problem. Clara stared at the ingredients. Carrots, celery, potatoes, onion, fresh herbs. Nothing extraordinary. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Her knife moved steadily across the cutting board. Vegetables fell into perfect pieces. Butter melted gently inside a heavy pot. Onions softened until they became sweet and fragrant. Broth simmered. Herbs released their aroma. There was no secret technique. No rare ingredient. Clara simply cooked the way her mother had taught her. Patiently, carefully, with attention. By the time the soup was finished, the kitchen had grown unusually quiet around her station. Even the skeptical cooks seemed curious. Bernard tasted a spoonful first. His expression revealed nothing. Then he tasted another. A third. Finally he nodded. "Send it." The words barely left his mouth before servants rushed the bowl upstairs. Clara watched it disappear beyond the kitchen doors. Then she returned to cleaning her station. Whatever happened next was none of her business. Several floors above, King Rowan Blackthorn sat alone at a long dining table illuminated by candlelight. Rain traced silver lines across the tall windows behind him. Another meal waited before him. Another attempt. Another disappointment, most likely. He stared at the bowl placed carefully before him. Steam curled upward in delicate ribbons. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then he lifted the spoon. The first taste touched his tongue. Rowan froze. Something warm spread through his chest. Not the heat of the soup. Something deeper. A memory. A feeling. Home. His eyes slowly lifted from the bowl. The dining room remained silent. The servants held their breath. Rowan took another spoonful. Then another. And another. 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty. By sunrise, the entire palace knew something extraordinary had happened. For the first time in months, King Rowan Blackthorn had finished a meal. Servants carried the news through hallways lined with portraits of former rulers. Guards repeated it during changing shifts. Maids whispered about it while opening curtains and lighting fireplaces. The king had eaten every spoonful. In the royal council chamber, advisors exchanged relieved smiles. In the kitchens below, however, relief quickly transformed into panic. Head chef Bernard had barely stepped through the doors when a royal messenger appeared again. The young man carried another sealed order stamped with the king's crest. Every cook stopped working. Bernard opened the letter and read it silently. His eyebrows rose. Well, someone finally asked. Bernard lowered the parchment. His Majesty wants the same soup tonight. The room erupted with chatter. Several cooks immediately began claiming responsibility. I knew he would like it. I adjusted the seasoning yesterday. The broth was my recipe. Clara kept her eyes on the carrots she was chopping. The knife moved steadily across the cutting board, slice after slice. She wanted no part of the conversation. Unfortunately, the conversation wanted her. One of the assistant cooks pointed across the room. Actually, Whitmore made it. The kitchen fell silent. Clara's hands froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Heat rushed into her cheeks. Only because the original batch was ruined, she said quietly. Bernard stared at her for several seconds. You made the entire thing? Clara nodded. Yes, chef. To her surprise, Bernard did not look annoyed. He looked thoughtful. Very thoughtful. Make it again tonight. The room instantly filled with disappointed expressions. Clara wished she could disappear. Yes, chef. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Upstairs, Rowan stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study overlooking the northern forests. Morning sunlight spilled across polished wood floors. A cup of untouched coffee rested on his desk. Unlike previous mornings, however, the king did not feel exhausted. He felt awake, alert. The difference unsettled him. For months, every meal had tasted dull, empty. No matter how expensive or carefully prepared it was, nothing reached him. Then one bowl of soup had changed everything. Rowan closed his eyes briefly. He could still remember it. The flavor itself had been simple. Vegetables, herbs, broth. Yet beneath it had been something else. A feeling, warmth, patience, kindness. The sensation lingered like a memory he could not place. Find the cook, Rowan said. His advisor, Sebastian Hawthorne, looked up from a stack of reports. The cook, Your Majesty? Rowan nodded. The one who prepared last night's meal. Sebastian blinked. You want to reward them? Rowan stared out the window again. That would have been the logical answer. Yet it was not the truth. I want to know who they are. Hours later, the request reached the kitchens. Panic immediately followed. Cooks adjusted uniforms. Apprentices rehearsed introductions. Several people suddenly became very eager to be noticed. Clara became even more determined not to be. She spent her lunch break in a small storage room organizing sacks of flour simply to avoid attention. The scent of cinnamon clung to her sleeves. Before returning to work, she quietly added fresh cloves to the small pouch she kept hidden in her apron pocket. The familiar fragrance surrounded her instantly. Safe, hidden, invisible. Yet for the first time in years, the protection felt less certain. Because somewhere above her, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom was searching for the person behind a bowl of soup. And Clara had a feeling the search was only beginning. The requests began arriving every evening. At first, the kitchen staff treated them like a lucky coincidence. Then they became impossible to ignore. One night, it was Clara's vegetable soup. The next evening, the king requested the same cook prepare a roasted chicken dinner. 2 days later, he asked for fresh bread served alongside a simple stew. By the end of the week, an unspoken routine had formed inside the royal kitchens. Whenever a special order arrived from the palace, head chef Bernard quietly handed it to Clara. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody volunteered. The results spoke for themselves. Clara never asked questions. She simply cooked. Yet each request made her increasingly uneasy. Every time she prepared a meal, she felt as though invisible threads stretched somewhere far above her station, winding through stone corridors and royal chambers towards someone she had never met. Someone who kept returning. One cool evening, she stood alone near the ovens, shaping loaves of bread. The rest of the kitchen had already finished most of the dinner preparations. Soft golden light flickered across the polished counters. The scent of yeast and herbs drifted through the room. Clara pressed her palms gently into the dough. The simple motion calmed her. Baking always had. There was comfort in creating something with patience. Something reliable. Something that asked for nothing in return. She slid the loaves into the oven and brushed flour from her hands. Beside her apron pocket, the familiar pouch of spices rested against her hip. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, protection. The scent followed her everywhere now. Sometimes she wondered if she even remembered what her natural scent smelled like beneath all those layers. The thought made her chest tighten. She quickly pushed it away. Upstairs, Rowan sat alone in the palace library. A fire crackled softly inside a stone hearth. Shelves filled with centuries of history surrounded him on every side. An open book rested on the table before him. He had been staring at the same page for nearly 20 minutes. He could not focus. Instead, his thoughts drifted toward dinner. More specifically, toward whoever had prepared it. The king frowned at himself. It was ridiculous. He did not know their name, their face, their age. He knew nothing. Yet somehow every meal felt familiar, as if each plate carried a quiet message hidden beneath the ingredients. Tonight's bread had reminded him of childhood mornings before responsibility claimed every hour of his life. The stew had reminded him of long winters spent beside his mother while snow covered the forests beyond the palace walls. They were memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Yet this mysterious cook seemed able to uncover them effortlessly. Rowan leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. For years people had tried to impress him. Noble families competed for attention. Visiting dignitaries offered gifts. Advisors praised him. None of it felt genuine. But these meals never asked for recognition. They simply arrived. Honest, warm, quiet. Somehow that made them impossible to forget. The next morning, Sebastian found Rowan standing near the breakfast table, finishing another meal. The advisor nearly dropped the reports he carried. You finished everything again. Rowan glanced at the empty plate. Apparently. Sebastian smiled. The entire kingdom would celebrate if they knew. Rowan looked toward the windows where sunlight spilled across the city below. Have you found the cook? Sebastian hesitated. Not yet. Rowan nodded once. Strange disappointment settled inside his chest. He immediately disliked it. Why should it matter? Why should one unknown cook occupy so much space in his thoughts? Yet that evening, when another meal arrived, he found himself wondering the same thing he had wondered every night for the past week. What kind of person put so much care into feeding someone they had never met? And far below the palace, Clara stood beside a simmering pot, completely unaware that the king had begun looking forward to her meals more than any event on his crowded schedule. The first snowfall of the season arrived 3 days before the winter court banquet. White flakes drifted past the palace windows and settled across rooftops, gardens, and stone pathways. Inside Blackthorn Palace, preparations consumed every corner of the estate. Nobles from across the northern territories were arriving by carriage. Musicians rehearsed in grand halls. Servants polished silver until it gleamed beneath chandeliers. The annual banquet was the most important social gathering of the year, and everyone knew exactly what made this year different. King Rowan Blackthorn was smiling again. The change had not gone unnoticed. Advisors saw it during meetings. Guards noticed it during inspections. Even visiting nobles whispered about it. The king seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden had quietly lifted from his shoulders. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed that change. Lady Victoria Ashcroft certainly did not. She stood near a ballroom window watching snow fall across the palace gardens, her jaw tight with frustration. For months, she had positioned herself as the most likely future queen. Her family possessed influence. She was beautiful, educated, and well-connected. Yet despite years of effort, the king remained distant. Then suddenly, an invisible cook had succeeded where she had failed. It was insulting. Worse, it was dangerous. Victoria had spent enough time observing palace gossip to recognize a pattern. Every improvement in the king's mood coincided with meals arriving from the royal kitchens. And now rumors suggested he was actively searching for whoever prepared them. Victoria intended to discover that person first. 2 evenings later she got her chance. While visiting the kitchens under the excuse of reviewing banquet preparations, she noticed something peculiar. Every important dish eventually passed through one station. Clara's station. The quiet blonde woman barely spoke. She avoided attention. She lowered her eyes whenever nobles entered. To most people she appeared insignificant. Victoria trusted appearances less than most. She watched from a distance as Clara carefully adjusted a simmering sauce. The kitchen staff treated her differently now. Not openly. Not enough for outsiders to notice. But Victoria noticed. Respect lingered in their expressions. Curiosity, too. By the time she left the kitchens, suspicion had taken root. The following morning, disaster struck. Or at least that was how it appeared. During preparations for the banquet, a valuable bottle of imported saffron disappeared from storage. The spice was worth hundreds of dollars by palace standards and had been reserved for the king's private table. Accusations spread immediately. Servants searched cabinets. Inventories were checked. Voices rose. Then someone claimed they had seen Clara near the storage room earlier that day. The rumor moved through the palace faster than wildfire through dry grass. Clara stared in disbelief as head chef Bernard informed her of the accusation. "I did not take anything," she said quietly. Bernard looked troubled. "I know." But uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Clara felt it immediately. The familiar ache settled in her chest. She had seen that look before. Doubt. Suspicion. The willingness to believe the worst because it was easier than believing the truth. By sunset, royal officials arrived at the kitchens. They requested Clara's presence at the winter court banquet. The words sounded polite. They felt like a sentence. As she followed them through the palace corridors, her fingers tightened around the spice pouch hidden inside her apron. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, the scents that had protected her for years. Ahead, music drifted from the grand ballroom. Hundreds of nobles gathered beneath crystal chandeliers. At the center of it all sat King Rowan Blackthorn. And for the first time since arriving at the palace, Clara Whitmore was about to step directly into his world. The grand ballroom seemed impossibly bright. Crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across polished floors while musicians played softly from an elevated gallery. Noble families filled the room in elegant gowns and tailored coats, their conversations blending into a steady murmur. Clara felt every eye on her as she entered. Her simple kitchen uniform looked painfully out of place among silk and jewels. She kept her gaze lowered and followed the royal officials toward the center of the hall. At the far end of the room sat King Rowan Blackthorn. For a brief moment, she looked up. Their eyes met. Clara's breath caught unexpectedly. The king looked nothing like the distant figure described in stories. He looked tired and strong at the same time, like someone carrying responsibilities heavier than anyone realized. Before either could react, Lady Victoria Ashcroft stepped forward. Her smile was flawless. Her voice was not. "This is the woman who was seen near the storage room before the saffron disappeared." Whispers immediately spread through the crowd. Clara felt heat rise in her face. "I did not take anything," she said quietly. Victoria tilted her head. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were there." "I was organizing supplies." "Convenient." More whispers followed. Clara's fingers tightened around the spice pouch hidden inside her apron. The familiar scents grounded her. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, protection, safety. The life she had carefully built inside the palace depended on remaining unnoticed. Rowan rose slowly from his chair. The room fell silent. "Has any evidence been found?" he asked. Victoria hesitated. "Not yet, Your Majesty." "Then no conclusions should be made." His voice was calm, but the authority behind it carried across the ballroom effortlessly. Clara felt a flicker of relief. Unfortunately, it lasted only seconds. One of the officials stepped forward holding a storage ledger. As he unfolded the document, he accidentally collided with Clara's shoulder. It was a small bump, barely enough to draw attention. Yet it changed everything. The spice pouch slipped from her apron pocket. Time seemed to slow. Clara reached for it. Too late. The pouch struck the marble floor. The thin stitching split apart. Cinnamon scattered across the polished stone. Cloves rolled in every direction. Nutmeg dust rose into the air like a golden cloud. A collective gasp swept through the room. Clara froze. For years, the spices had hidden her scent beneath layers of warmth and fragrance. Now, with the pouch broken open, those layers vanished all at once. Her natural scent emerged before she could stop it. Soft, clean, familiar, like fresh bread cooling on a windowsill after a winter storm. Like wildflowers blooming after snow melted away. The ballroom fell completely silent. Several alphas turned instinctively toward her. Not because of dominance. Because the scent carried something impossible to ignore. Rowan stopped breathing for a moment. Every meal, every memory, every feeling he had experienced over the past weeks suddenly connected. The warmth in the soup, the comfort in the bread, the kindness hidden inside every dish. It all belonged to her. Clara's heart pounded. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She stepped backward. One step, then another. The silence only deepened. Rowan descended the platform slowly, never taking his eyes off her. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, the mysterious cook and the king stood only a few feet apart. And in that moment, neither of them noticed the nobles, the accusations, or the missing saffron. They noticed only each other. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. Clara could hear only the sound of her own heartbeat. The shattered spices remained scattered across the marble floor. Cinnamon dust rested like gold powder beneath the chandeliers. Every layer of protection she had built over the last 3 years was gone. She wanted to disappear. Instead, She stood frozen beneath the attention of an entire ballroom. Rowan stopped a few feet away. The distance between them felt impossibly small. Up close, Clara could see faint shadows beneath his silver eyes. She could see the exhaustion that months of sleepless nights had left behind. More importantly, she could see recognition. Not the recognition of a king discovering an omega. The recognition of someone finally finding the answer to a question that had haunted him for weeks. "It was you," Rowan said quietly. Clara lowered her gaze immediately. "Your Majesty, I am sorry." Confusion flickered across his face. "Sorry." Her hands trembled. "I never intended for this to happen." Around them, nobles exchanged curious whispers. Some looked shocked. Others looked fascinated. Lady Victoria looked furious. Clara barely noticed any of them. Old memories had returned too quickly. She remembered another crowded room years earlier. Another gathering filled with watching eyes. Another moment when people learned exactly what she was. The memory still hurt. She had been 20 years old then. Young enough to believe kindness would be enough. Naive enough to trust promises. Her family had arranged a formal introduction with a respected alpha from a neighboring territory. Everyone expected a match. For weeks, she had allowed herself to hope. Then came the rejection. Not private. Not gentle. Public. Humiliating. The alpha had laughed when he discovered her scent. He had called her forgettable. Ordinary. Unworthy of attention. The room had laughed with him. Clara never forgot the sound. Afterward, she stopped trying to be noticed. She left home. She found work wherever she could. Eventually, she arrived at Blackthorn Palace. The spices came later. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. They helped hide her scent. More importantly, they helped hide her fear. "Miss Whitmore." Rowan's voice pulled her back to the present. She looked up cautiously. The king's expression had softened. "Why did you hide?" Clara almost laughed. The answer seemed obvious. Because it was easier. Silence followed. Then an older noblewoman near the front stepped forward. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. Perhaps the young woman should explain why she concealed her identity inside the royal household. Clara felt dozens of eyes settle on her again. She swallowed hard. "I did not hide because I wished to deceive anyone." Her voice shook slightly. "I hid because I wanted peace." The ballroom grew quiet. Truly quiet. "I came here to cook," she continued. "Nothing more. I never expected anyone to notice me. I never wanted anyone to." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the broken spices. Being invisible felt safer. Something changed in Rowan's expression then. Not pity. Understanding. For the first time, he realized that every meal she prepared carried pieces of herself. The patience, the warmth, the comfort. None of it came from someone seeking attention. It came from someone who had spent years believing she deserved none. Across the room, another royal official suddenly hurried through the crowd carrying a small wooden box. He approached the king and bowed quickly. "Your Majesty, we found the missing saffron." A murmur swept through the ballroom. The official opened the box. Inside rested the stolen spice. It was discovered among Lady Victoria Ashcroft's personal supplies. The room exploded with whispers. Clara stared in disbelief. Victoria's face drained of color. And for the first time that evening, every eye in the ballroom turned away from Clara and toward the person who had truly created the scandal. The ballroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Lady Victoria opened her mouth as if searching for an explanation, but none came. The evidence resting inside the wooden box spoke for itself. Conversations erupted around the room. Nobles exchanged shocked glances. Advisors whispered behind raised hands. Yet Rowan barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on Clara. She stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, surrounded by scattered spices and unwanted attention. Even after her name had been cleared, she looked ready to apologize for taking up space. The realization tightened something inside his chest. For years, people had approached him seeking power, influence, or favor. Clara had wanted none of those things. She had only wanted to cook. Slowly, Rowan crossed the remaining distance between them. Every eye in the ballroom followed his movement. Clara noticed it too. Her pulse quickened. Instinct told her to step back. Instead, she remained still. "Miss Whitmore," Rowan said softly. The title sounded strange coming from him. Respectful. Genuine. Clara looked up. "Your Majesty. Look at me." She hesitated before obeying. The moment their eyes met, the noise around them seemed to fade. Rowan saw uncertainty there. Fear. Years of disappointment carefully hidden behind quiet strength. He understood more than she realized. He knew what it felt like to carry expectations until they became chains. He knew loneliness. He knew exhaustion. Somehow, through simple meals and quiet acts of kindness, Clara had reached parts of him no advisor, noble, or healer ever had. I spent weeks searching for the person behind those meals, he said. Do you know why? Clara shook her head. Because every plate reminded me that goodness still existed. The room grew quieter. Every meal felt honest. Every meal felt like home. Clara felt tears threaten to form. She blinked them away immediately. Rowan continued. I thought I was searching for a cook. A faint smile touched his face. I was searching for you. Across the ballroom, several nobles stared openly. No one expected the king to speak this way. Clara certainly did not. Your Majesty, I am only a kitchen worker. Rowan's expression softened further. And I am only a man who forgot how to enjoy life until someone reminded him. The words settled over the crowd like snowfall. No grand speech. No dramatic declaration. Just truth. Clara looked away briefly. Her heart felt far too full. You do not know me. I know enough. Rowan glanced toward the shattered spices still scattered across the floor. I know you spent years hiding because others failed to see your worth. Clara swallowed hard. The old wound still ached. They were not entirely wrong. Rowan's answer came immediately. They were. The certainty in his voice stunned her. Before Clara could respond, something even more surprising happened. The king of the Northern Territories lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Several nobles nearly dropped their glasses. Advisors stared in disbelief. Clara froze completely. Your Majesty, she whispered. Rowan ignored the shocked reactions around him. His eyes never left hers. I need you to understand something. His voice remained calm. Steady. Certain. I did not begin searching for you because of your scent. The entire room listened. I began searching because your kindness reached me long before I knew who you were. Clara's breath caught. Rowan offered a small smile. I fell in love with your heart before I ever learned your name. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And standing beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, Clara felt something she had not felt in years. Not fear. Not shame. Not loneliness. Hope. Winter loosened its grip on the Northern Territories slowly. Snow remained on distant mountain peaks, but rivers flowed freely again, and the first signs of spring appeared throughout the kingdom. Months had passed since the night that changed everything inside the grand ballroom. 2. The surprise of many nobles, Rowan never treated Clara like a symbol or a prize. He treated her like a partner. He listened when she spoke. He sought her opinion during long walks through the palace gardens. He asked questions about her childhood, her favorite recipes, and the dreams she had quietly buried years ago. For Clara, the adjustment was not easy. There were still mornings when she woke expecting everything to disappear. Years of rejection had taught her to prepare for disappointment. Yet day after day, Rowan remained exactly who he had shown himself to be. Patient, honest, kind. The kingdom noticed the difference as well. The king who had once seemed distant now attended community gatherings. He visited villages. He smiled more often. Even his advisors admitted that the palace felt brighter. Some credited Clara's influence. Rowan agreed. Spring eventually brought another celebration to Blackthorn Palace. This time, however, the event carried a very different purpose. The great hall filled once again with nobles, merchants, military leaders, and visiting families from every corner of the kingdom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of smiling faces. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Music drifted through the air. Unlike the previous banquet, there was no tension, no accusations, no fear. There was anticipation. At the center of the hall stood Clara Whitmore. She wore a simple ivory gown that reflected candlelight softly. Though many had offered elaborate designs covered in jewels and embroidery, she had chosen something elegant and understated. It felt more like herself. Rowan stood beside her. Looking around the room, Clara saw something she never imagined possible. People were not staring because she was being judged. They were smiling because they were happy for her. The realization nearly brought tears to her eyes. Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies ended, the palace doors opened to reveal a surprise prepared entirely by Clara. Long tables stretched across the adjoining hall. Every surface overflowed with food. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, soups, stews, fruit pies, cakes, family recipes collected from villages across the kingdom. Dishes inspired by the meals that had comforted generations of ordinary people. Guests stared in amazement. You cooked all of this? One noblewoman asked. Clara laughed softly. Not alone. She gestured toward dozens of palace cooks standing proudly nearby. Head chef Bernard stood among them, looking more emotional than he would ever admit. We all did. The feast became the highlight of the celebration. Nobles sat beside farmers. Advisors shared tables with soldiers. Everyone ate together. Everyone laughed together. It felt less like a royal event and more like a family gathering. As the evening continued, Rowan rose from his seat holding a glass. Gradually, conversations quieted. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Clara felt her heart flutter. The king smiled before speaking. For many years, I believed strength meant carrying every burden alone. Silence filled the room. I believed leadership required distance. I believed responsibility demanded sacrifice. His gaze found Clara immediately. Then someone reminded me that even a king needs kindness. Clara lowered her eyes, overwhelmed. Rowan continued. The greatest thing I have ever received was not wealth, power, or victory. He paused briefly. It was a simple meal prepared by someone who expected nothing in return. Many guests smiled knowingly. Rowan lifted his glass slightly higher. The greatest thing I ever tasted was not food. It was the heart of the woman who made it. Applause erupted throughout the hall. Clara laughed through tears she no longer bothered hiding. Later that night, after the celebration ended and the palace finally grew quiet, Clara found herself standing in the royal kitchen. Old habits were difficult to break. A small pot simmered gently on the stove. Rowan entered a few moments later and immediately smiled. I thought I might find you here. Clara stirred the soup and laughed softly. Some things never change. The familiar aroma filled the room. Simple vegetables, fresh herbs, warm broth, the same meal that had started everything. Rowan accepted the bowl she offered him and took a careful taste. The flavor was exactly as he remembered. Comfort, home, hope. He looked at Clara standing beside him beneath the warm kitchen lights. No crown, no ceremony, no audience. Just the woman who had changed his life. Outside, spring rain tapped softly against the palace windows. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warmth. Clara slipped her hand into Rowan's. He held it gently. Neither spoke for several moments. They did not need to. Some stories ended with grand declarations. Theirs ended with something simpler. A shared meal. A quiet kitchen. Two hearts finally at peace. And for the first time in many years, neither of them felt alone.